Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in just a few minutes to give people a little more time to join. If this is your first webinar with us, keep in mind that half of it is an audience Q&A, and we really appreciate your questions. If you think of any questions during the panel, please submit them using the Q&A feature rather than the chat. But you're welcome to talk to each other using the chat. There's about 20 people here, and we'll probably expect another 20 or 30 before we get started.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Dan Sarowitz. I'm with the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes at Arizona State University and Issues in Science and Technology magazine, a partnership between ASU and the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. And I am really happy to welcome everyone. Introduce today's event.
My name is Dan Sarowitz.
Alternative meets bring the Heartland
Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes at Arizona State University. And
so before introducing our speakers and moderator, I simply want to just say a word about our general goal for these events, which is in part to bring really interesting people with expertise around topics that are perhaps not so common, but represent the action of technology, science, and society that we feel in the real world. And so from that framing, we're after not just a discussion among experts, but also involving you in the discussion. So about half of today's event will be a moderated discussion among our panel of experts, and the other half will be responding to questions that you ask and that you feel are interesting and important. So to enter your questions, use the Q&A function on Zoom, not the chat function. You can use chat to chat amongst yourselves, but for questions to panelists, use the Q&A function. So let's get started. Can alternative meats bring the Heartland more than burgers? Our panelists are Alex Smith, who's a food and agricultural research analyst from the Breakthrough Institute, and he and his Breakthrough colleague Salani Shah recently wrote a piece for Issues in Science and Technology called "The Government Needs an Innovation Policy for Alternative Meats." But Alex and Salani have written lots more than just that. Very productive in this space. Second panelist is my colleague at ASU, Christy Spackman. She's a faculty member at our School for the Future of Innovation and Society, and she works on the question of how sensory experiences of making, consuming, and disposing of food are influenced by the food production process. And so she's going to have a really different perspective to bring to this conversation. And then our third panelist, for yet another perspective, is someone who's putting his money where his mouth is, or will be, Johnny Ream. He's a partner at Stray Dog Capital, which is a venture capital fund that invests in innovative early-stage alternative food and biotech companies. And then finally, we're going to be moderated by, or immoderated by Amina Khan. We're really happy to have her. She's a science writer at the LA Times. She's a book author. She's a Knight Journalism Fellow. She covers a range of topics, everything from Mars rovers to linguistics to bio-inspired engineering. And I understand that along with others of us at Issues in Science and Technology, she is interested in termites as well. So I'll turn it over to Amina to get the formal events here underway. So thanks very much, everybody. We look forward to the event.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Dan. Really appreciate it. And I'm very excited to be here with Alex, Johnny, and Christy. It sounds like it's going to be a great discussion. Before we get fully moving into, the questions of today, I wanted to ask each of our panelists a little bit about how they got interested in this subject. What was their entryway into alternative meats and the many different impacts they could be having on the US and the world at large, specifically when we're talking about the economic impacts that we could be seeing sometime in the next few decades. Christy, why don't we start with you?
Good afternoon, everyone. Amina, this is a really great question. So I started to get interested in alternative meats probably when I was doing my doctoral work in food chemistry before I switched and moved to social science, because there's such a great chemical/food science question. How do you create something that carries similar sensory properties in a way that meat eaters get excited about? It's just a wonderful scientific question. And that, I think, is when I actually first started playing around with eating alternative meats and have enjoyed the different sensorial experiences and sometimes have really disliked the different sensorial experiences that has brought me. So that's my background.
All right. Alex, can we hear a little bit about what your background with alternative meats is?
Of course. I come from it. I'm sort of actually a new convert into the field to some degree. I for a long time didn't really think that they had the sort of what it needed to get over the hump in some ways. But since I've joined the Breakthrough Institute, which is a environmental think tank and very much focused on greenhouse gas emissions as well as other sort of environmental harms, I've sort of developed more of an understanding of the issues with animal agriculture. And also the issues in changing people's diets and how difficult it is to reduce and change what a whole nation, what a whole globe of people actually eat, and have been sort of, I wouldn't say wooed, but grown very interested in sort of the potential of alternatives to sort of replicate, as Christy was talking about, the texture and taste of meat and the possibility that that has for driving replacements of conventional meat. I also think I've also had good and bad experiences with alternatives, but really mostly good. So I'm excited on a personal sort of gustatory level, but also excited on a potential global sort of environmental level.
All right. And Johnny, why don't we move to you?
Absolutely. Thanks, Amina. Yeah, from my perspective, I really got into this space. I think it was really spawned out of some family health issues that ultimately got me looking at, a predominantly plant-based lifestyle. And at the time I was in traditional venture capital. And, fast forward some years later, I ended up getting introduced to the fund where I am a partner at now, Straight Out Capital. And they were investing in this space, and got to explore the disruptive nature of changing the food system and why that was important, and all of the negative externalities that exist around our current food system. And so, being able to sort of have this investment role and function paired with being able to invest in companies that are actually changing the world for a better place, that was a wonderful thing to me, to be able to pair those things together. And so that's ultimately how I got exposed to this space.
All right, thanks. Very interesting. I'm sort of wondering, when we're defining alternative meats and cell cultured meat, are we talking about the same challenges for adoption by consumers and for scaling them up? Or are there different problems for cell cultured meat as there are for other alternative meats that are currently on the market, plant-based meats?
I think this is a really interesting question you're getting at. When we say alternative meats, what do we actually mean? And thank you for disambiguating between plant-based meat alternatives and cell cultured meat. I think writ large, the distribution chain questions remain really similar. Where do you get your supplies from? How do you get the food out? It's when you get into the smaller little bits of how things are produced that I think we start to see the differences. And for this, I'm actually going to ping over to Alex, because he and his co-author had some really interesting things to say about the regional challenges that differ between a plant-based meat product and a cellular agricultural product.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. I think what you're getting at is sort of the like relationship between plant-based and like sort of conventional agriculture, crop agriculture, and lab cultured or sort of cultivated meat. I think there are a lot of terminologies for lab-grown meat, and their sort of lack of relationship to existing sort of supply chains around agriculture. I think to sort of get at that question is, as you said, there are questions about sort of feedstocks and the supply chains that go into it. But the radical difference in like the actual production model and the actual sort of product that is coming out, where plant-based meat is just heavily processed vegetable ingredients mostly, and sort of pulses and other kinds of ingredient plant material, where lab grown or cultivated meat is literally cells grown from mediums given sort of the right environment to grow. And that process can be taken, it is currently sort of reliant on cells taken from cows that exist in the world. But like, as I think ideally in the future, it would be something that we can have like some kind of cells that are database that can grow, that will grow not from sort of existing animals, and will be tied specifically to like organizations and the companies and not to the sort of real world existence. So, I mean, I think just at that sort of base level, there are deep similarities and radical differences in terms of like what are the potentials for growth. There are also a lot more technological barriers facing cell cultivated meat right now than there are facing plant-based meat. I mean, we have really one example of commercialized cell cultured meat, and that's through the Eat Just meat that's being sold in Singapore right now. It's currently being delivered to people as well. It's very cool, but it's also very expensive. I think one meal for them is 20 pounds, I think, per dish. I'm not exactly sure if that's right. Whereas we see Impossible Meat, we see Beyond Meat sold at Costco, we see it sold at CVS's across the country. And it's already sort of out there, and it's already being developed and sort of redeveloped, as we see Beyond Meat just announced yesterday basically the newest update to their burger coming out, which is supposed to be even meatier, even better. But I haven't tasted it, but it'll continue to grow. Whereas we still haven't seen the sort of penetration into the market of the self-cultivated.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, you're hitting on, I guess, like a broader question, which is like, what are some of the roadblocks to getting a product that is not just, environmentally friendly, or hopefully with like a less, a lower greenhouse gas profile, a lower land use profile, but that is also just affordable and accessible for the vast majority of Americans and consumers around the world. Like, how do we like what are the issues, and how do we get there, and how could government funding potentially fill in those gaps? What could it do?
I'm happy to take that one. A couple thoughts. Thanks for those thoughts, Alex. Those are great. Yeah, I think that thinking about some of the issues when we're looking at it from an investment perspective, we see a lot of opportunity on the plant-based side to develop better functioning ingredients, and so that may be discovering new plant-based ingredients that we might be able to achieve a better sensory profile in terms of taste, in terms of texture, and beyond and impossible. Some of these companies have done a fantastic job, but I think to really unlock the next stage of growth and adoption by consumers, we're going to have to get a lot better. And I think that what we're seeing consumers demand today is not only those things, not only the great taste, not only the great texture that mimics the animal-based counterparts, but they also want to do it with really short ingredient profiles, with ingredients that they can understand. And so I think technical achievement around how do we achieve that, I think that's what needs to happen. And it's a lot of research and development at the front end. The same thing exists on the cell-based side, in that if you look at all the cell-based companies that are out there, we count over 100 today. Most of them are focused on a lot of the same things, and it's how do we develop cell lines that can grow the way that we want to? How do we develop media that we can feed the cells in order so they can grow efficiently and at a low cost? How do we develop new bioreactors that have never been created at this sort of volume? These are a lot of things that are very early fundamental, that are fundamental to this space. And I think that, me coming from a venture capital fund, sometimes it can be very difficult to fund these things because of the risk profile. When you think about a venture fund, most of them are 10 years long, 12 years maybe with an extension. And then, it's unclear if you were to try to go achieve one of these specific things, one of these needs in these spaces, how would that technology exit? And so, I think that public funding has the opportunity to play a really major part in this space by providing government programs that might fund some of these very, very specific things. And lastly, I'll just allude to the Good Food Institute put together an amazing array of solution objectives that are very specific. They get down to very technical things that they believe will be needed in order to push the space forward. Those are all outlined on the Good Food Institute's website. But, essentially, I think a lot of funding around research, maybe some development around college curriculum and programs, and then maybe even on the production side where we might have access to early to mid-stage co-manufacturing space that is often hard to get for people starting companies in the early stage. So those are, I'll stop there, but those are some things that we see as needs on the technical side in ways that government funding can get involved.
Can I bounce off of something you just said, Johnny? I love how you highlighted this need for better functioning ingredients, because it does pull us back into the distinct differences in a way between, if you will, the plant-based meat alternatives and the cell cultured approach to a meat alternative, which is this imagination, or maybe this technological utopianism or optimism, depending on where you situate yourself, that we can actually break foods down to their constituent parts and rebuild them into something that's as good or better, which obviously from a tech standpoint is like the most exciting thing about this. From a food science standpoint, the most exciting thing. From a cultural standpoint, and perhaps from a nutrition standpoint, something we should be a little more concerned about. What do we potentially lose as cultures as we start reimagining our foods these way? We might gain something too. I don't want to overlook that possibility. But also, do we even have a deep enough grasp with our understandings of nutrition and biological chemistry to really do this in a way that isn't ultimately harmful in the long run? And I think we're seeing with some of the research that has come out in the past 20 years that, certain things that, while on the surface appear to be not harmful to human health when ingested over long periods of time, might actually cause problems. And so how are you dealing with this tension from a venture capital perspective, and how might our government want to deal with that tension? I think is a fun thing and also a critical thing to think about.
Yeah, it's a good question, Chrissy. I mean, I think, I think that we have the tendency to, like I mentioned before, we look for, particularly on the plant-based side, we look for companies that are producing products with very few ingredients, very recognizable ingredients. And so, really emphasizing that, we think that that's where the space is going. That's where consumer demand is going. So thus that is where we would like to go too, because we want to push those companies into market. With regard to more of the cell-based side, I think that, there's opportunities that we see on both the GMO and non-GMO side. And I think probably that's some of what you're referring to. And, I think, we just have to be careful. I think this is a long timeline. And I think that, government research around this space could greatly benefit, pushing the space forward in terms of what do we know is healthy, and what can we learn about what is not healthy. And so I think government could also play a role there in the early stage sort of testing and understanding of what sort of ingredients should we be thinking about, what sort of processes should we be thinking about that are good for consumers.
Yeah, and to sort of add to that, I think another element in which the government has some real ability to sort of make a difference is really in just fundamental cell biology and sort of cell chemistry. And I think that still has these issues that you're bringing up, Christy, but are also ways in which we can maybe start to understand a little bit of the relationship between human health and sort of this cell tinkering that we're doing at this point to try to get this kind of lab-grown cultivated meat out there. I think also to just think about the question, and I appreciate that you brought up this has potential risks, but it also has potential to really change and evolve how we eat, how we do all these things in a way that could be positive. I think it's also important to think about what exists today and what this could be in fact replacing, or at least sort of mitigating the harms of. And if we're looking at animal agriculture, if we're just replacing beef, for example, we're replacing the animal slaughter. That's the one thing that is definitely going away by replacing any amount of beef with cultivated meat. We're also replacing a lot of the environmental harms that are existent today, a lot of sort of air pollution, water pollution, the kinds of human health issues that arise from animal agriculture that are both antibiotic risk, but also risks of colorectal cancer, risks of different kinds of heart diseases. So, I mean, I definitely think the question is really interesting, but I do think we need to balance the possibility of future harms with the existence of contemporary sort of harms right now.
That's really interesting. And I think one of the things we haven't really touched upon is the potential economic impacts on meat workers. People who are already in the existing meat industry, they're often in rural communities. If this industry were to take off, the alternative meat industry, what would this mean for them? And are there ways that the alternative meat industry should be held responsible for trying to mitigate those impacts? And are there ways that the government should help them to mitigate those impacts?
I'm happy to provide a perspective on that one. I think that, where the industry is now, alternative meats make up roughly, I think they say about 1% of the entire meat market. So it's relatively low now, but I believe the most studies show that it's around a $7 billion market now, growing at roughly 25 to 30% a year. So we could see this industry double every roughly 3 years. And so I would say that it's growing really rapidly. And so I think there is the potential that we will see some decreased job growth at some point, or perhaps even negative job growth on the conventional animal agriculture side. And so I think what would be really important to understand would be, having some studies to understand what is the impact to some of those labor groups, and understand, what are the roles, what are the skill sets that are being displaced, and then building out a mapping for how many of those jobs might be absorbed by, plant-based coming into this space. And I think that there's an opportunity for potentially plant-based to take some of that, and then perhaps even completely different sectors or industries that might suit the skill sets of some of these workers. So, it could be something like solar manufacturing, but understanding what the expected displacement will be and understanding where that mapping occurs, I think that's going to be a critical effort. So, understanding the impacts, mapping the transition, and then building some programs around easing that transition. So maybe it's training programs, maybe it's certification programs. I think that's going to be key on the labor side. And those are some things I think the government can play a part in, as they've done with renewable energy.
Johnny, I love what you said about this being attentive to the larger personal impacts that these sorts of shifts can have. And I think one of the challenges with our current conversation around plant-based meat products and these cellular agricultural products currently constituted is these reproduce some of the greatest harms of our current industrial food system. So the concentration of nodes of production away from maybe a local based or even a regional based situation to much larger, longer distances between places has been part of the challenge for many of our rural communities around the United States. And what I'm seeing with places like Beyond Meat, Impossible Burgers, and even these cellular agricultural approaches is that because they have come into being within that system, they're not yet reimagining that system. And so I think one of the things that would be especially neat to see from a policy perspective are policies that promote, if you will, a bit of redundancy in our food system that allows these systems to kind of re-regionalize. And I'm not here arguing for a locavore 100-mile food radius imaginary. That's not the world that I think is the world that makes sense, but rather something that can better withstand the sorts of shocks like what we've seen over the last year with our food system, where it had to retool itself from doing one form of supply chain into another form of supply chain. So how could we use this opportunity to make maybe food hubs in each state that are going to really be focused on, what are the things that the state does? And here again, and when I say things that the state does, what do we grow well? What does our geography even allow? And then taking advantage of those agricultural university systems to really build out regional-based strengths.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think the ability of the U.S. government in the past 15 years to sort of place and cite like manufacturing hubs. I think the example that my colleague Sloane and I in our ISTPs used was the Manufacturing USA program that's created 15 manufacturing hubs in different places across the country, including one in St. Paul, Minnesota, that is about bioindustry. It's called BioMade, that I think has some even direct sort of possibility in hitting onto cell cultured meat and sort of the growth of bioprocess industrialization and sort of scale. I think building up, there's sort of, in my mind, there's a tension in some ways between both of these things that I don't know if it is actually a proper tension between sort of the value of scale and being able to sort of bring these meats to market and bring them to market at a cost that is going to be lower than conventional meat. And I think there's still a lot of questions, as Johnny was saying, I think is clear just in how little there is out there in terms of how small of a market plant-based have, how zero of a market that cell cultivated meat has. But I think there's a potential for even like different kinds of production at scale, but across like regionally dispersed. And the examples include like brewing. I think a lot of people look to sort of microbrewing as an imagination of what cell cultivated meat could be in a way that is more geographically dispersed and brings economic benefits to sort of a wide array of locations in the country. I think maybe a more realistic vision is just looking at sort of large scale breweries and how they have impacted sort of rural, or maybe not rural, but not necessarily just the coastlines, not necessarily just San Francisco, LA, and New York, but places all over the country. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions still to remain, both in terms of how the field will impact conventionally, but also like at what level of scale will it become efficient? Is it going to be at a scale that is like having one or two massive factories? Is it going to like replicate the Chicago stockyards of the late 19th century, or is it going to replicate like ethanol plants right now, which hit a sort of max efficiency at a relatively small scale compared to other kinds of industrial production, but are the most efficient at that level? So we may see benefits to having much more regionally dispersed, much more sort of much more geographically widespread production models.
This is all fascinating, and it just occurred to me, I want to see if we could do a little thought experiment and see what your guys' ideal future looks like. So say that you all have, I don't know, an unlimited amount of government funding to dole out to the alternative meat industry to sell cultured meat. How much do you give? In what formats? And what strings do you attach? Are you worried about, say, any research money that you give being siloed within that company? Are you concerned about whether people will move their factories? I don't even know if this is possible for cell cultured meats, but overseas. Are there stipulations to try and keep people local? Do you put limits on the ingredients they can use? I mean, what's sort of, if you held the bags of money, what would you do with it? And let's start with Johnny.
That's a good question. There's a lot there to unpack. No, it's good. I think the overarching thing that I would say is I believe that there is so much work that needs to be done on the research side, like I've mentioned at the front end, with both regard to plant-based and cell-based meats. I think I would give funding, and I would bias it towards that area. So significant amount of capital there. And what I would do is I think I would look to make it either accessible via the public domain so that everyone has access to it, or I would look to produce some sort of format where a consortium of companies in the space would have access to it, and maybe they also sign up for some KPIs and some metrics by which they're going to achieve some goals. And the reason I say that is because what we're seeing right now in the private markets is when there's 100 cell-based companies out there, they're all more or less pursuing a lot of the same things, trying to achieve the same goals. And so if we could provide some funding where a lot of these companies could leverage a lot of the research that's out there, I think they would do a great job of pushing this space forward much, much faster by sort of giving opportunity to, rise the tide per se in the space. And so, I think that's right. I would look for an opportunity on the research side for the funding and look to make it widely available.
How much money do you think it'll take?
That's a good question outside of my area of expertise, but I would say, the Good Food Institute, I think, put together a good plan about how far $2 billion would go, which I think is a pretty low number with regard to what we're seeing in some of the other spaces that could achieve a lot of the things or fund a lot of the things that they've identified. So even starting with like a low single-digit billion-dollar number, I think could provide dramatic impact in the space.
Thank you. Christy, what about you? Oh, I think you're muted. There we go.
Always takes a minute to realize that. I'm so intrigued by your question, because one of my underlying questions that I have about this is, to me, what is the problem that I as a government am trying to solve? And if the problem is questions of, like, we want to diversify our agricultural, like our mode of doing agriculture, great. I'm very interested in throwing money at this. But if the problem we're trying to solve has to do with climate change or access to food, I'm not convinced that throwing money at alternative meats is the way to go. I actually think that sure, maybe a portion of it, and I especially loved what you said, Johnny, about making this available in the public domain, because once again, if this is about environment, there are other approaches. Is this not, to use my colleague Dan Terowitz's statement, a technological fix to a social problem? The social problem being we like to eat too much meat, and there are societies out there who already have really valuable, robust food cultures that don't rely on meat or even meat alternatives. And so it really raises for us this question of, should we rather be focusing on social conversations? Should we be focusing on helping people find ways to reimagine, let's call it a lentil burger, et cetera, so it's really appealing to the US-based palate? And so my inclination would be to diversify that money out, so it's really focused on promoting social change, but also, because I like to have options, still continue to support research in this direction.
Awesome. Thank you, Christy. Alex, what about you?
I want to parrot what Johnny and Christy have already said, but I think they both hit on general tenets of what I think about this. It's a very hard question, and I also don't have a good answer for like how much money would be the ideal amount. As Johnny said, I think Good Food Institute had about $2 billion estimate of R&D choices. I think like what Ezra Klein this weekend wrote in the New York Times, I think is sort of an interesting thing in there. And he basically argued that you need to have a ton of investment in R&D right now, because the politics of like sort of reducing meat consumption, or the politics of having policy that reduces meat consumption, is going to be is right now and will probably continue to be very, very difficult. And that creating sort of an industry that can compete with taste, price, et cetera, with conventional meat is going to be very valuable in the long run. So I do agree that like open access R&D focused on reducing price, getting product diversity up, so being able to sort of replace more than just ground beef, maybe things like really good chicken breasts, like fish fillets, in the long run steaks with fat and all that kind of stuff, would be really great. I think that there's also, as Christy was saying, a real value in diversifying investment in terms of if we're focused on environmental processes and sort of trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. My colleague Dan Blustermacher and I wrote a piece recently about how even if alternative proteins are like maximized and we're able to sort of hit the highest projections that anybody has right now, there's still going to be a really large amount of meat consumption in 2050 and 2060. So we need to both invest in alternative proteins, we need to invest in sort of improving livestock production, invest in sort of improving crop production, invest in really all aspects of agricultural R&D aimed at increasing productivity, increasing yield, reducing land use, and sort of overall reducing sort of the environmental harms from agriculture. And that, I think, includes alternative proteins, but is not alternative proteins alone.
Very cool. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it. I think we can move on to our Q&A portion. I'll start off with an anonymous attendee who wants to know, what does plant-based or cell-based meat production actually look like from an employment perspective? Could it employ a similar number of people? Does it require different skills or education? Can it employ large numbers of immigrants as traditional meat processing does? I don't know which one of you guys might want to take a stab at this. Alex, you're on my screen, so I'm gonna target you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question, and I think it's something that I'm very interested in, and I think my organization is trying to answer. But at this point, it's very unclear what the kind of potential employment would look like for a plant-based and definitely for a sort of lab-grown cultivated meat industry in the future. It's really unclear whether these jobs could be unionized, whether the industry is willing to have unions in the industry, as we talked about, where the industry would be located. So, I mean, fundamentally, the only answer I have is I don't really know. I think it's something that will require a bunch of research, and really won't really know until these industries grow and we're sort of able to sort of map out what these industries will look like at scale.
I anticipate.
Go ahead, Chrissy, please.
I anticipate that initially it's going to be a higher skilled sort of workforce, and then that shifts as it becomes increasingly industrialized. And so the question once again becomes, what do we want our food system to look like? And when Alex was speaking earlier about intensifying agriculture, I'm also intrigued by what does it mean if we rather than focus on intensifying, diversifying. So similarly, as we look at our current industrial food system, it relies very heavily on massive farms that produce a lot of things very well with increasingly, hopefully fewer inputs and hopefully less impact on the environment. But we have a nice long history during the Green Revolution of demonstrating that, oh crap, we didn't realize that putting all this phosphorus on was also going to have these issues. And so to create jobs for this workforce is going to actually require we diversify rather than intensify.
Yeah, that's great. I was only going to add that I think there's at least one study, it's a very small study that's been done out there, but there is, I think, more work that can be done around understanding these impacts and what it would look like in the transition. But I think that when we think about what it might look like in the future, would be on the plant-based side, definitely geared more towards traditional food production. So, we would still have traditional food manufacturing and production and supply chain and logistics jobs in that regard. On the cell-based side, it would kind of like what Alex was alluding to before, the production will very much look like the state of like a beer brewery or something of that nature. And so heavy on sort of the biological sciences on the front end, but then kind of representative like skill sets that you might see at a brewery. So I think that's, what those transition plans look like, and the degree to displacement, like I alluded to before, I think remains to be seen. But generally speaking, I think that's what we could expect to see.
Great, thank you. We have another question here for Johnny. What critical factors are you looking at to determine how much the alternative meat market will grow? And what are some of the most important cultural and public opinion components to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure that we do anything overly scientific to look at it, but we look at consumer demand, and we look at, we break up markets and we use different data services that look at what sort of products are people buying, and the growth rates of those particular categories within plant-based, but also the larger meat market. And so, we look at that to gauge where do we think that where are there big opportunities. Some categories are smaller, some categories are bigger, and that drives some of our decision making around what companies do we fund, what emerging brands do we fund. So we look at that. Issues from kind of a cultural or consumer adoption perspective. Yeah, I think that, Beyond Meat and Impossible have developed some amazing products. And I think that we've seen some really great adoption. Beyond did a study at one point that showed that most of the people, or a high percentage of the people that had put a Beyond Meat product in their shopping cart, were actually considered themselves flexitarians, not vegans or vegetarians or anything like that. And so I think that to increase that further, to gain adoption from a consumer perspective, the products need to become even better and even more resemble some of the animal-based counterparts that are out there. And so, on the plant-based side, I think it's about getting the products to a superior level. On the cell-based side, it's pretty unknown. I think there's going to have to be a lot of consumer education around how are we building these food products and how are we developing them? Because Alex said, we haven't really seen any commercial example aside from, Singapore recently launching with Just Foods, a cell cultured product. And so, more to come on that side, but I think it's going to be interesting to see. And I think it's going to require some additional consumer education.
right. We have a question here from Lisa Adam. She says, if plant-based meats take off, is there any worry that there will be a need to expand agricultural land at the expense of currently non-agricultural land, like grazing land? So she's not unmuted herself. She's asking because she just read an article by Bird Canada about the role of privately owned grazing land in providing habitat for prairie birds. And those are the same birds who could not thrive in agricultural land. So are there any sort of these somewhat unforeseen consequences that we might worry about if the makeup of meat, the meat industry changes?
I'm going to take this, and then perhaps my colleagues have a little bit to add. So I want to bound my answer by saying I'm not an agricultural economist, but we do know, for example, that at least beef is incredibly inefficient at converting plant-based food into meat. And because of that, I anticipate that the vast amount of cropland that are currently used to produce feed for cattle, assuming these aren't range-fed cattle, would become the thing that feeds into our plant-based meat system. I love that this reminder, though, that there are these additional ecosystems we need to think about. And I think one of the big concerns when you imagine perhaps a dystopian future and really push this out, where meat production has almost disappeared for some, like there's been some massive cultural shift in how we imagine things, or the planet has really hit its worst case scenario, that we also lose a bunch. So going with Aldo Leopold's idea of thinking like a mountain, we have been working alongside animals as a species for a really long time. And as a result, we've created these ecosystems that now look natural, but are actually really dependent on this coexistence of grazing, et cetera. And this isn't the intensified confined animal feedlot model. It's a very different model, but it is a model that we shouldn't discount in our thinking.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, it's an interesting question. And I think what Christy is saying makes a lot of sense, especially for beef. I think there are definitely some questions that remain about land use because of the ability of cattle to sort of use marginal lands to pasture. But at the same time, 97% of US beef production is finished on feedlots, so that roughly like 20% of their lives, or maybe a little bit less than that, are in confined or semi-confined operations where they're fed corn and soy and other kinds of grain concentrates. So if ideally what would be eaten into would be that amount of sort of crop production that is being used to feed cows, and then for chickens and pigs, very little of that of meat production for poultry and pork is pasture based. It's really is range land at all. It's mostly feed. It's going to be, and again, like beef, there is less of an efficient sort of transition from like sun to plant to animal than there would be from sun to plant-based meat potentially. So yeah, the land use I think in the short term, there may be, you could imagine a future where plant-based meats take off and conventional meat doesn't respond, or responds very slowly, and you see a rise in land use. But if we are sort of seeing a long run shift, the land use would ideally be going down for agriculture as a whole.
I agree with Alex and Christy, both great points. We see it the same way.
Very cool. And we have a question here from Sarah Guerin. She says, there's been a lot of discussion about the role of government in improving the outlook for alternative meat. However, we just witnessed right-wing media expressing outrage that politicians were trying to, quote, end meat in America, end quote, based on inaccurate characterization of newly proposed climate policy. Why are you optimistic about the role of government here, given the similar potential to spin anti-meat narratives out of government support for alternative meat development? And Johnny, since you're up and you've got a vested stake in this, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I would say the way I see it and that we see it is we don't think that, traditional animal agriculture is going away. There's going to be a section of the population that will choose to not eat plant-based products and not eat cell-based products. So we ultimately don't see it going away, nor do I think that I don't know whether government putting, even if that was true, even if that statement was true, government putting restrictions on what people can eat in that way, I'm not sure if that's the best way that we see from our perspective. From our perspective, we want to fund great companies that are producing craveable products that people really want to eat. And we think that if we can do that, the rest will take care of itself. So that's what I would say on that.
Very cool.
I have similar worries to whoever posed the question, especially around if we are sort of if there is a necessity to say like remove subsidies for conventional meat, or to somehow further regulate the industry, or further regulate a very under-regulated industry. I see there being some legitimate sort of political pushback and difficulty there. I do wonder if focusing this on innovation and R&D, which is sort of how we've imagined it in my organization, I think a lot of people are imagining it does sort of shift a little bit of this political discourse and turn it into a way that I think the people who are really responding negatively to made up rumors about 90% meat reductions from the federal government, whether they can sort of see this in the economic growth sort of argument of this, and this could be a more palatable kind of vision for public policy. But again, if it becomes something that is just completely intractable, I'm not a snake charmer. I don't really know how to imagine a future where this becomes not politically tractable in that case.
It's interesting. Yeah, I remember from the article that you wrote on this subject, I think you said there are at least 10,000 meat workers in 36 different states, and it's a $100 billion industry dominated by 4 major companies. So that's a lot of political power. It seems pretty daunting.
Yeah, and there's more and more journalism coming out sort of showing the relationship between industry and state in a lot of places. There's a great piece in Fox about pork production in Iowa that came out a couple weeks ago that sort of shows there is a lot of connection between the state, in that case the state of Iowa, and the pork industry, and I think that may be true across different states and across the national government.
I think this brings us back to that earlier conversation that food is really a social thing. And all of this, even a conversation about spinning alternative meat into a left-wing policy thing, that's really rooted in these historic and contemporary imaginations of how what we eat makes us into who we are, and whether meat eating is something that goes alongside some sort of form of masculinity or not. And so I think here we just start seeing the constant, wonderful and frightening slide between conversations about sustainability, food, bodies, and ideology that are all rooted in how we all individually imagine ourselves and how we've been historically trained to imagine ourselves.
All right. We have a question here from Stephen Zwick. I kind of feel, Christy, like this might be one you might want to take first, but we'll see. How exactly does ultra-processed food made with ultra-processed ingredients from industrial monocrop crops grown with lots of agrochemicals change the real problem, which is degenerative food production? How exactly does this improve the health of soil ecosystems? Cultured stem cell proteins are also entirely reliant on industrial monocrops for amino acids, i.e. soy and sugars, like corn or wheat, in the cell media to grow the stem cells. So how does using degenerative industrial ag differently really improve the overall food production system? And there's a reason I write rather than talk out loud. Usually my apologies to Stephen Zwick, but Christy, what do you think?
I don't know what we mean by degenerative food production, but I understand the rest of the question. So I'm going to set that aside.
Cool.
I think this is a really critical concern, and I come at this perhaps because my brother-in-law is deeply embedded in the permaculture world. We have seen degradation of soil over the 20th century with how we do agriculture, and farmers themselves are aware of this. And so one of the interesting, fun, and very critical challenges for those folks who, like Johnny, who are working on imagining a disruptive food system is to see if these approaches could extend beyond just a minor disruption from meat to a meat alternative, and instead to a systems-based disruption. And one of the concerns that's been kind of pushed at here, but not really highlighted around these alternative approaches, is the way in which they could disenfranchise everyday folks from seeing themselves as active producers of food. Now, I love 20th century agriculture for how it's made time for me, specifically as a woman, to do things that aren't like what my grandmother did, who grew up on my dad grew up on a farm. So there's this like intense work that they all did. And only one of those uncles of mine has chosen to stay in farming and actually drives truck and works as an electrician because he can't make enough money farming. And so we have all of these tensions here. And I think this is where the government could play a key role alongside venture capitalists and others, which is in highlighting a holistic approach. And I don't think that there are folks who are up at the top sitting there saying, oh, we want to ruin our soil. That undoes the entire aim of government-funded agriculture. Rather, it's that we are siloed and working towards a transdisciplinary approach that promotes multiple ways of doing things, hopefully will help address this. So I'm being optimistic, but I like that world.
So a more resilient system, essentially, in that way, yeah.
Yeah, which I think this is critically important we at Straight Out Capital, our venture fund is really focused on bringing plant-based products to market. But there's this whole issue at the front end, exactly what the person that asked the question, and Chrissy, what you touched on in that, look, we need to make sure that our soil is going to be healthy for a long time so that we can provide this whole sustainable food system. It's not just providing what is the product that I'm eating on my plate, but how is it produced? And how do we make sure that we can continue producing those things for years and years and years? And that means supporting soil biodiversity and making sure that what comes out of the ground, we can attain the proper nutrients from that. And so I think, organic programs and incentives around farmers that use those programs might be something that would be really interesting to think about, just to make sure that we do look at this holistically, kind of like Christy alluded to.
I think both of you have great points, and I don't really have much to add to either of these.
Very cool. Well, thank you, Alex, Christy, Johnny, for a really fascinating discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time. It's given me a lot of food for thought. I definitely am craving a burger, vegetarian burger, but still a burger. And I think I'll hand it over to Dan to wrap things up.
Okay, thanks, Anna, and thanks, Alex, Christy, and Johnny. I will say, I hope not gratuitously, this was an incredibly interesting conversation. And one of the things that made it interesting was both the combination of complexity, right? So we're talking about everything from jobs and economics and innovation policy to culture and morals, all rooted around this thing called food that's central to our lives. If you like that kind of, oh, and I should also say tensions and complexity that are not easily going to be resolved, many visions of the future. If you like that kind of conversation, it's the kind of conversation that doesn't maybe happen enough in our world when we're dealing with things like emerging technologies. You've come to the right place. Come to our next event. Visit us at www.issues.org. And we hope to see you at a future conversation. Thanks for your great questions. Again, thanks to the panelists. Thanks, Amina, for leading a fantastic conversation. And we will see you all next time. So take care, everybody. Have a great day.